I'd like to welcome you to Monday's edition of the Walk Through Romans. Today we're going to be looking at Romans, the 8th chapter, and we're actually going to cover several verses today, but we're going to cover these verses as a topic, not so much as a verse-by-verse analysis, even though we're going to be doing that also. Because the Apostle Paul, starting in Romans 8 and Romans 8 verse 5, and going down through Romans 8 verse 8, the Apostle Paul is talking about two different people. He's talking about a saved person, and he's talking about an unsaved person. So we're going to begin today by talking about an unsaved person. What are the conditions of an unsaved person? You see, the book of Romans is written to teach us what salvation is. And in order to understand salvation, we need to know what an unsaved person is like and a saved person. You know, one of the things that many times I see is that Christians try to make unsaved people act like saved people. And you know what? It's an impossibility. So hang on, here we go. Romans, the 8th chapter, starting with verse number 5. For those who are according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. What's he talking about? He's talking about unsaved people. Unsaved people, what do? They set their minds on the flesh. Those who are according to the flesh. Now, what does this mean? The word according is the Greek word kata. And the Greek word kata means to come into a conformity, or actually, technically, it means to lean on something. If you set your mind on, or if you are leaning on the flesh, and by the way, that's the only thing an unsaved person's got. They don't have a new creature inside of them. They don't have a spirit that's been made alive by God. They are setting their lives and depending on, leaning on, and conforming their lives to the flesh. You know what? Unsaved people live in sin. We need to understand that. Never try to make an unsaved person live for Jesus. It's not going to work. Why? Because they don't have the Spirit of God on the inside of them. Now notice he says that those who are according to the flesh, what do? They set their minds on the things of the flesh. We talked last week about how your mind is the decision-making part of your being. An unsaved person always turns to the flesh. They always set their minds on the flesh. Now, let me say this. Flesh does not mean body. Flesh means carnality. It's the Greek word sarx, and there's the Greek word sarx, which means not only your physical being, but it also means the desires of the physical being. And there's the Greek word soma, which means the body. Now, an unsaved person is constantly thinking about their carnal nature, their sinful nature, if I could use that term. Why? Because they have no other nature. They are not born again. They don't have the Spirit of God on the inside of them. And now we're going to continue in our description of an unsaved person. Verse number 6 says this: for the mind set on the flesh is death. The mind. Now we've got a mindset. The Greek word here actually means to have a mindset about something. You ever run into someone with a mindset? I was just having lunch the other day with a friend of mine who is a missionary in Mexico, and we were talking about certain Mexican foods and how some Americans don't want to eat certain Mexican foods. Why? Because they have set their mind against it. I love lengua, which is cow tongue. I just think it's the most flavorful, most tender meat. But there's a lot of Americans that will not eat lengua. Why? Because they have a mindset. And so in verse number 6, the Apostle Paul says, for the mind set on the flesh is death. What is death? We've talked about this in the past. Death doesn't mean to cease to exist. Death means a separation from life. You see, when your mind is set on just all the desires of your carnal or sinful nature, you know what? When your mind is set on that, you know what it produces? It produces death. It produces a separation from the very life of God. But now, as we go on, in verse number 7, the Apostle Paul tells us why. Why does this unsaved person have their mind set on something that's going to kill him? And he says, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so. Now notice, he says that the mind that's set on the flesh is hostile towards God. It has a hatred for God. Why do the unsaved people hate the saved people? Why are they persecuting? You know, we are seeing persecution rates that are higher than any time in history. Why is this happening? Because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God. It doesn't submit to the law of God. It doesn't say Jesus is Lord. Now, just as soon as a person says, Jesus, be the Lord of my life, you know what happens? You get a new nature. And you get freedom from that old mindset. Now, notice the last parts of verse number 7. It says, for it isn't even able to do so. You know what? An unsaved person cannot live like a Christian. An unsaved person cannot live the fullness of the God life, the life that God intended for them. So, if you're not a born-again person, you know what? Turn your life over to Jesus. Verse number 8, and those who are in the flesh cannot please God. You know what? Just as soon as you say, Jesus, be the Lord of my life, you know what happens? God's pleased. God's pleased. God comes and he says, oh, I am pleased with this person. My time is up for today. Thank you for watching. If you're not a born-again believer, if you're not a saved person today, turn your life over to Jesus. Receive forgiveness of sins. Receive his righteousness and begin to live his life through yourself. Thank you for watching.